Check to make sure
that we're live. Okay, I think we are live.
Yeah.
So welcome, guys, and gals, to week 2 of the Standardism Book Club, discussing James Sire's book, The Universe Next Door. You are looking at your host. Oh, and there's the book, showcased prominently by John. It says John in the top left corner. I don't know if all of us are seeing the same kind of view.
Yeah.
And there's me, Alan, and there's Tim. So we are JAT, also known internally at Standardism as the JAT crew. JAT.
I was hoping that you'd never mention that.
Ever.
Well, okay, let's just pretend I didn't.
Okay.
We've shifted locations. So now, actually, I noticed that I have the banner next to my ear right there. So we've moved, but we're still the same people. That's presuming that we are not just physical entities and that our cells have just changed over. It presumes that we have an enduring soul that extends beyond our bodies and remains consistent through time. But that's a discussion for another time.
It is.
Or just a little bit later.
Perhaps in 15 minutes, in fact.
Yeah.
All right. So, we are going to be talking about chapter, is it 4?
Yeah, chapter 4.
Yeah, chapter 4, Naturalism. And as we've mentioned before, we're not really going to be teaching the content or necessarily going systematically through everything in it. We're just kind of reading it along with everybody else and just highlighting elements that we thought were interesting or significant or confusing or perhaps that we disagreed with. So that's kind of where we are headed.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just briefly mention naturalism for those of you who didn't read the book. Shame on you. No. So naturalism basically is the view that nature is all there is. In other words, there's no the only thing that exists is physical matter, right? There's no God, there's no spirit, there's no angels, there's no souls. On page 57, in fact, he says that prime reality is matter. It's all there is. There's no God. Carl Sagan and James Sire here makes mentions of Carl Sagan's quote here that the cosmos is all that there is, or ever was, or ever will be. So that's the view of naturalism. And so we're going to be talking about the implications of that worldview with regards to a whole bunch of different categories. So, yeah. So what did you guys think? Did you guys like the chapter overall? Didn't like it?
Yeah, maybe I'll start. I overall like the chapter. To be honest, it made me more confident that naturalism cannot possibly be true.
It didn't shake your faith?
No, it didn't. It just, you often don't think about all the arguments one after another. You don't often ask yourself all of these big questions like he does in sequence about, prime reality, about morality, about what happens after you die, about us as conscious beings, reason, rationality, where does that come from? He's just knocking these things off and describing what happens, what consequences result, or what those answers are on a naturalistic worldview. And to me, again, it was like a cumulative case. And by the end of the chapter, I'm just kind of stunned that anyone would be a naturalist, and I understand there's a lot more going on, and there is arguments, there's rejoinders to some of these things, but overall, I thought the case is, it's pretty compelling, and so that's, I was pretty impressed. What do you think, John?
Actually, before you jump in, John, let me just add on that I agree with what you're saying there, Tim. And also, I noticed it wasn't even like he's making a case against naturalism.
No.
But he's just simply trying to present naturalism for what it is.
Yeah.
And kind of like you're saying, Tim, it's like when you hear it and you hear the ideas and what it leads to, it's rather bleak.
Yeah. And he doesn't, by the way, he doesn't hide his Christian worldview, his Christian bias, but he's doing his best. And you go read the Amazon reviews people will say, yeah, he does a fair job. I mean, they use this as a textbook for world religions and worldviews in secular universities, because he does a pretty fair job outlining what these worldviews entail, and without trying to bring in his Christian worldview. But you can tell he's not hiding it.
Well, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, John. Go ahead. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything.
Actually,
you guys just talk. I'm just here to be a pretty face.
You're doing a great job at that.
Yeah.
No, I think Tim, I agree with everything you said. When reading the book, I thought it was a really fair assessment. And like I think it's important to state up front that there are rejoinders. A naturalist who's certainly versed in philosophical naturalism could respond to a number of the points Sire makes, but that's not the point of the book.
Yeah.
The point of the book, I think, is to give us a broad overview, an honest and fair look at these different worldviews, and then it's up to us to, through the answering of these, how many questions? Is it like 7 or 8 questions or something?
Yeah.
That Sire asks, to see which worldview lines up with reality, which one has the most explanatory power.
Yeah.
To the way the world really is. And I have the same reaction kind of when I was reading this. And I used to be a naturalist. So when I was reading this, I kept writing in my margins. I told Alan this before the broadcast started, but but how? But how are you getting this? Like, how are you, I'm trying to find an example now, but like what did we mention it right here? I thought maybe before the broadcast we said, but the brain secretes thoughts as the liver secretes bile. And like that statement on its face, and this is one of the things I think Sire says about naturalism, why it has staying power at the very end of the chapter, is because it seems cogent. It seems like it makes sense. But when you start thinking about this stuff, the brain secretes thoughts as the liver secretes bile. Well, wait a second, what? On naturalism, how are you measuring thoughts? Like what do we have available to us through a naturalistic lens to measure thoughts? I mean, bile is easy, right? We can drain bile, we can weigh it, we can put it in a certain vessel and see how much it fills up. We can get its mass, we can get its buoyancy or whatever, and but you can't do that with thoughts. I mean, how many thoughts fit in a beaker? A 20 milliliter beaker. I don't know. So it just, I found myself asking of the worldview as a whole, but why or but how a lot.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm at. How about you, Alan?
Well, yeah, I mean the point you're making there, or that quote by Cabinas, the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile, was sort of in the context of this idea that, look, we're basically, if naturalism is true, we're basically a complex object, right? So he talks about in the discussion of the nature of humanity, and kind of in the conversation about free will.
Yeah.
He says, in the cosmos, there is one substance, matter. We are that, and only that. The laws applying to matter apply to us. We do not transcend the universe in any way. And I think this is incredibly important, because the laws that apply to matter are the laws of chemistry and physics, right? And so if we're also matter, then those same laws apply to us and to our brains. And so the question about thinking and whether there's even rational thought or any of these, what is the reliability of our faculties? This is completely cast into, it's now up for grabs. Like, is there any question whether we can have any sort of reliable thought? And so that's where he talks about, that quote. He says, first of all, let us conclude boldly then that man is a machine. And this is Lemaitre, who obviously is not a Christian here. That man is a machine, and that in the whole universe there is but a single substance with various modifications. So in other words, yeah, we're just machines, and we can't have independent reason and thought that's independent of physical actions. So therefore, the brain's going to secrete thought like the liver secretes bile. The liver secretes bile in not any kind of like thoughtful way, like it reasons through an argument, through premises and conclusion. It just does it.
Yeah.
And same way, the brain's just going to the brain's just going to secrete thought with no thought about it, which is crazy. So this, I believe, undermines free will as we kind of typically conceive it, you know.
And Sire addresses that a little bit. You know,
What's
he
that?
talks about determinism. Sire talks about determinism and the existence of free will. But even just going back to the basics of that statement, there's so many parts of that just short statement that you read that we interact with the world around us just as every other bit of matter does, or we adhere to these certain laws. I mean, you're presuming order, right? So you're presuming the idea that where these laws come from, you know, that matter has to obey. At the most fundamental level, it seems to me like naturalism really fails. You can't even have a coherent discussion on this stuff without the assumption of the laws of logic, for example, right? So on naturalism, I don't know where are you getting the laws of logic? You know, how are you placing any meaning on anything, even the words that we're using to discuss the topic? And then even if you don't want to grant, even if you just want to grant that to them, where are they getting this idea that the universe comes prepackaged with order and design? You know, the liver secretes bile because it's designed to do so. That's what it does. So that's a product of evolution. Okay, so now you have to show to me how did thought evolve? And then how did thought evolve in such a way that it detects for truth, adhering and searching out to what is true, not just what is the best survival mechanism. I mean, there's just so much there to talk about, even in that one statement.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, and I think you're raising the Alvin Plantinga is kind of made famous. Well, you know, I think C.S. Lewis kind of touched on it too, but the idea of this kind of evolutionary argument against naturalism.
Yeah.
And
I thought this was my original argument.
Yeah,
it's yours.
Yeah, we'll give it
John Noyes argument.
Yeah. Well,
No,
maybe
that's where I got it anyway.
Yeah, and there's
little book.
There's so much good stuff there. What did you guys think of this? Kind of going back to like the first couple pages of the chapter, he opens up talking about the transition from. This is something I hadn't considered before. The transition from deism to naturalism. And to be honest, had never thought of the connection between those two things. So Alan, what did you think of that?
Yeah, I was actually intrigued by that as well. I posted about this somewhere online. I'm trying to remember where, but so the comment he makes is that deism is the isthmus between two great continents, theism and naturalism. He says to get from the first to the second, deism is the natural route. Perhaps without deism, naturalism would have not come about so readily. And so then he kind of gives examples of thinkers who kind of went that route and stuff. And I thought that was really fascinating because, I've always seen theism, deism, and naturalism as sort of different levels of belief in God, or, but I've never seen them or thought of them as succession.
Yeah. And
so, but that makes sense, especially in light of the way he kind of outlined these other thinkers, as Descartes and Locke and Lemaitre.
I thought
I thought that was fascinating. That was something I hadn't considered.
I'm trying to think now. I mean, I read the chapter a few days ago, and I think this is from him, where he describes theism as God having these attributes. And then deism is the idea where you kind of lessen some of or take away some of the attributes. So you take away him being God being a personal being and interacting with and caring about the world and this kind of thing. And then he said that naturalism is where you take God's existence. So you don't mess with his essence and his character, his attributes. It's God with no existence. I just thought that was kind of a clever way to move from theism to naturalism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, it goes both ways too, I think. oftentimes the theist will go through deism to naturalism.
Yeah, that's right. I think somebody was raising the question whether that happened with Antony Flew, the British atheist, atheist naturalist. He was, for years an atheist, and then eventually became, did he become a deist, or did he become a theist?
Yeah, I've been listening to his audio book, and just recently, popped it, got it on my phone, signed up from the library, and it appears to me that he calls himself a theist, but it depends on what you mean by some of these terms. It didn't sound like he certainly says that Christianity is a plausible theism,
right.
But he doesn't, at least in the parts that I've read, doesn't believe necessarily in the resurrection, or so I wouldn't call himself a Christian theist.
Sure.
But he describes, he thinks the fine tuning argument and the design of life, and these are he thinks strong arguments for God's existence.
Yeah.
Cool.
So just to close out on that thought about the whole free will thing, I remember I wrote an article about, because I think Stephen Hawking, I forget which book he wrote, but I'll put a link in the either on Facebook or YouTube here, but where he talks about determinism being a natural consequence. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, if determinism is true, then how can you account for free will and the rationale of thinking through ideas and putting them on paper? And wouldn't everything that he wrote eventually be the result of a deterministic process? And if so, then how could you say it's true or false? It just is what he wrote. So, and then I argue that free will makes better sense in the Christian worldview, where you have a soul that is non-material, not affected by, at least directly, by the laws of physics and chemistry, and how that could potentially ground free thinking, reasoning, deducing, conclusions from premises, and so on and so forth. So, I'll throw that in there at some point.
That's good.
Yeah. So the other thing that I was kind of taken by was actually his opening quote by John Updike, the pigeon feathers. So I mean, this is just the very beginning of the chapter, where he doesn't really describe what he's doing here, but it seems to me that what he's pointing to is that if naturalism is true and there is no soul, there is no God, then when you die, you just die. Your body just decomposes, and since you are just your body, you are just matter, you just decompose, and that's it. There's nothing more to it. And so, have you guys read Pigeon Feathers, like the whole thing? Yeah,
No,
I actually heard of it. But he in the story here, he says that this guy David is given a vision of what death is like, and presumably in a naturalistic accounting, if you will. He says there's a long hole in the ground, he said, and the hole's no wider than your body, and down which you are drawn while the white faces recede. So I'm just assuming or picturing, like, you're like lowered into this pit, and as you get lower, you just kind of see people's faces sort of just recede as you get thrown in there. And it says you try to reach them, but your arms are pinned, right? Because you're just in this hole. And then shovels pour dirt in your face. There you will be forever in an upright position, blind and silent. And in time, no one will remember you, and you will never be called. As strata of rock shift, your fingers elongate, and your teeth are distended sideways in a great underground grimace, indistinguishable from a strip of chalk. And the earth tumbles on, and the sun expires, and unaltering darkness reigns where once there were stars. I'm just like, holy cow, like, talk about bleak, but again, this isn't proof that naturalism is false, but it just shows the consequences of what it means if naturalism is true. You just get buried, and strata of rock just shift, and they just just move your teeth in different directions, and that's it. There's nothing more to it.
Yeah.
Reminds me of Greg's chapter in Reasonable Faith, where he talks about the kind of the consequences of naturalism, where he unpacks it for a whole chapter. But I don't know, I was really taken by that little opening quote.
Yeah, I really like that quote too. It made me think of Hobbes. Have you guys read Leviathan, where Hobbes is describing what life for man would be like outside the context of society? It's coming from a naturalistic point of view, so he's grounding some of things of meaning, purpose, and stuff in living in groups in society, which is some truth to. But it says that then he goes on to say that outside of that context, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Mm. And it's just a really good, like that, what you just read, Alan. I think it's a good summation, if we're being at least intellectually honest about the meaning and purpose of life on naturalism in its ultimate sense. I'm not saying that that the naturalist doesn't derive meaning or purpose for their life. They most certainly do, because their life is meaningful. It is purposeful. But it's just, if you follow things out to the logical conclusions, it goes where, well, we're nothing but these pieces of chalk, right? Yeah. The darkness, not even darkness, nothingness, nihilism, ultimately, which is what we'll get to eventually. But that's really good, Alan. Thanks for bringing that up.
I would just add that I think this speaks to consistency, and there's a lot of people who aren't, in the ivory towers. They're not reading philosophical naturalists. They're just swimming in the culture, and just like a fish doesn't know it's wet. The naturalistic worldview, the relativistic worldview, these worldviews are out there, right? They're kind of, and so if you're wise to them, then you spot them. You see when Coke has a commercial and says, "You do you," this kind of thing. You say, what worldview is in play here? Or you're watching a movie and you see a worldview, and it starts to, you start to see these things. I think that a lot of people don't think about the naturalistic worldview, and as a result, they're just kind of taken in by it, but they follow the implications. They don't follow the consequences. And this is what happens when you don't think about these kinds of big philosophical questions, these worldview questions. And so when, we're talking about death and what happens when you die. And I mean, just from personal experience, I know people who, if you just ask them if they're an atheist, they would say, "Yeah, I don't believe in God. I don't believe in a higher power. I don't believe in supernatural stuff." Right? But they haven't studied, they haven't read, books and on it. That's just their belief. Right. But then when they're at a funeral, they so-and-so is in a better place now. Mm-hmm. And talking about it as if they're watching us right now. Right. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like these worldviews. I was giving a eulogy for my grandfather at the grave, at the gravesite, talking about how his hope and all this stuff. And then this lady came up to me, who I didn't know, I guess was a friend of a friend or whatever. Right. And she said, that there's a dragonfly going around you as you were speaking. And I said, okay. And she said, that was your grandpa. And that's not the naturalist worldview. That's a different worldview. Yeah, but right. All I'm saying is people just, and I don't think she would call herself a Hindu. I don't know if she, would necessarily even think about reincarnation in that way. But people just say stuff, and their beliefs are all disjoint. And Greg Koukl does a great job illustrating this when he'll pull out a puzzle, and dump the pieces on the floor, and he's like, "Look at your worldview is like this puzzle, and some of you have pieces missing, and some of you have pieces from other worldviews that are jammed into this puzzle. It's not, they don't belong in this puzzle." Right. And I think there's a lot of people who would maybe not even know what the word naturalism means, but they would say, "Yeah, nature is all there is, just the cosmos." Mm-hmm. But then they have all these other pieces about, like, when I'm at a funeral, I talk about people being in a better place. Like, I actually believe that. Well, okay, those don't mesh, So consistency is such an important point. And this is what I found when I was reading through this, is like, wow, I just felt kind of burdened for the naturalist who has to, see, okay, if I hold the naturalism, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this, I believe this. And man, it's a hard worldview for someone who really buys it and thinks it's true. Man, it's a hard world to live practically. Right?
Yeah. I think that's a really great point that you bring up. My family, my whole family on my side are all atheists. And it's really interesting listening to them talk, especially as we struggle. I mean, my parents are getting older and things happen in our families, and as we go through hard times, it's interesting hearing them, send good thoughts, my way. And I'm like, wait a second, what's that even mean? Like, what's it mean for me to send you good thoughts? I don't know I know what it means. I know what the gesture means. I know like the platitude, but like behind it, like, what do we mean? And I think that there's something there because intuitively we know that it's not just all the physical stuff that's around us. There's more to life than that. And when we struggle, I think oftentimes that comes out. And granted, this is experiential, like what you were saying earlier. Not everything, like we say here, I say at least, is an argument against naturalism or an argument for Christian theism. It's just my interaction with the world around me seems to lend itself in certain instances better to the Christian worldview, or at least a deistic worldview, than naturalism. And then that's just one instance of that, or holding people consistent to what they're saying. If you're a naturalist, and the next thing you're claiming objective, morality or meaning or purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, now let's talk about that. Where are you grounding that objectivity for those things, and why?
So. Yeah. I think it is uncommon to find people who think consistently, completely through the naturalistic worldview. Although it does happen, of course. One time I was at UCLA campus. There was an abortion protest happening. And so I went there because I just wanted to see what the protest was going to be like and just get involved in conversations and whatever. So I found myself in this conversation with this one guy who was arguing for abortion. And of course, I was arguing for the pro-life view. But in the midst of that conversation, he kept arguing that the unborn has no value, and I determined through our conversation that he also was an atheist, right? He's like, yeah, he goes, what? There's no value to unborn human life, And so as I discovered that he was an atheist, I decided to kind of follow his view to its logical conclusion. I said, well, you make a good point, actually. If it's true, if you're right, if atheism is true, if naturalism is the way the world really is, then you're right. The unborn doesn't have value. And guess what? Neither do you and I. Neither do you nor I. Neither do you or I. That's what I'm saying. Neither do us. Neither do we, right? We don't have value either. You don't have value. I mean, there's no reason why, if someone killed you, that they would be somehow extinguishing some valuable person. And so as I was trying to show him the consistency of that view, he surprised me. He goes, you know what? He goes, you're right. He goes, to be honest with you, I've often thought about killing myself.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, whoa, wait, no. I go, I actually don't believe that you're not valuable. I said, and I try to, remind him that I'm a Christian. I think you are valuable. You're made in God's image. You have intrinsic worth, so on and so forth. But I was intrigued that this guy actually had thought very seriously about the fact that not only does the unborn not have value if naturalism is true, but neither does he.
Wow. And
he was very depressed about it. So I got really worried. I actually ended up getting his phone number and contacting him for months afterwards because I felt a little bit nervous about that conversation. And I didn't want him to think that I was just kind of like mocking him for that. I didn't think he was going to be that consistent, was my mistake. But I just found it interesting that was an example of a person who was being consistent, and that was acknowledging that, if naturalism is true, even he as an adult does not necessarily have any value,
So Alan, I think you just answered Andrew Williamson's question in a way. He asks, how do you best bring the logical consequences of a worldview like naturalism up with a naturalist? Do you find a point of tension in the person's own belief system that shows that they are inconsistent with it? Perhaps a father who loves his child, but ultimately that love is simply the fizzling of chemicals in his brain. So I think what you just described, and this is a really good question, Andrew, thanks for asking. What you just described was kind of taking the roof off. Yeah, which we went through a whole tactic series. You know, we talked about this particular tactic. This is one of your favorite tactics to do, right? Is to use.
Yeah.
And so
reductio ad absurdum is it's a very powerful approach to take. Yeah, for anything, for anyone.
Yeah, and what you're doing is you're showing the person where the logic of their thinking ends up leading. And so this, I think, is a great tactic to use in a conversation with a naturalist. Again, the point is not to say, oh, you're wrong, you know, and you should change the idea is, I just want to show you, this is your belief. Let me get this straight. You, as you just said, you don't believe that human beings are valuable. I mean, this was the consequence of naturalism. And he agreed. Okay, then you know what? Why not kill ourselves? You know, if none of us have any meaning or value or purpose, why not? And I mean, the sad thing about that was, your point was you wanted him to say, no, we don't want to do that. I do think I'm valuable, right? And but he didn't. He actually followed the consequence of the view. So this is a powerful way when you're in conversation with people. Is just say, let me see if I got this straight, and then you give an example where take their view for a test drive and see where it leads. And it's often, especially for naturalism, the consequences are hard to swallow.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting on this point, and this is something actually, I don't know if have you guys read Abdu Mari's book on truth, Saving
Truth.
It's Saving Truth, right? I always mix it up with Nancy Pearcey's the title, you know.
Nancy all the truth because it's totally right.
I mean, both fantastic books, by the way. But Abdu Mari brings up a great, because we live in a culture of confusion, is what he says, and he goes through how it's actually gotten to the point now, and this I've experienced this in conversations where people are less concerned with the truth. So I've actually been in the conversation with my brother. He was out visiting me. It was before I was on at STR as a pastor at a church here. We're outside of my office in the parking lot talking about the existence of morals. And I'm just pressing him. Andrew, your question is how do you best bring this logical consequences of the worldview up to these people in the context of relationships and trying to work your way through the tensions? I know that really, really well. And what I try to do is I just try to hold my family consistent in their worldview. So I know where they're coming from. So every conversation that we have, I'm listening and I'm trying to gather what they are saying, and I'm lining it up in my mind with their worldview. And when they say something that's really inconsistent, I'll bring it up and be like, well, I thought that you said that there's no God and there's no absolute moral law. There's no objective morality out there. Then how are you objecting to X, Y, or Z? And I remember talking to my brother about it, and we got to the point where I brought up he bases his moral law in the existence or in social contract theory, right? So we get together as a society and we decide what's right and wrong, and Sire kind of talks about that in his book.
Yeah.
That like it's cultural, right? And then I brought up the moral reformist dilemma to my brother. Well, by very definition, Martin Luther King Jr. was immoral then, because if the culture comes up with what's right and wrong at any given moment, anybody who speaks out against that is by definition immoral and wrong. So it should be that should be stomped out right away. And it was great because in the conversation, just talking to him, he got it. But what really troubled me is after he got it, he says, you know what, John, you might be right, but I don't care about consistency. That's what he said. Like, I don't care. So I'm inconsistent here. And I'm thinking to myself, what in the world do you do with that? I just said to him, basically, I said, you guys can help me with this. I just said, well, I think our conversation's over then. If you don't care about consistency in your worldview, then I really got nothing left to say. The conversation's over. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Yeah, it's almost like it's cheating. It's like, well, if you're not willing to be consistent, then you could say any two things that are completely contradictory and it wouldn't matter, right? So, I mean, it's one thing to say, well, yeah, I guess my view is inconsistent. Let me try to figure it out. You know, I guess I'd be more sympathetic towards that. But somebody says, I don't even care about consistency. Well, then they can get away with making any two claims that aren't part of the same worldview and just be like, okay with that.
It's like going beyond postmodernism, right? Where there is no truth. Now there's truth, but who cares?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is that whole post-truth idea. And that's very difficult. I mean, as apologists, we're going to have to think through how to respond. Because I think you're right, John. There's, it's hard. I don't think relativism is now the dominant worldview. I think there's a lot of people who are making some objective moral claims out there. But when the facts don't line up, they just shrug their shoulders and say, well, who cares? You know, the preferences trump the truth. And so we're gonna have to deal with that. But as you were talking, I thought, what would I say? And to your brother, and it occurred to me that a lot of people have a problem with other people's hypocrisy, right? Like when I see, you know, if I see a pastor or a priest or something, here I see in the news, a priest preaching, you know, one thing, and then I find out the story breaks that he's molesting kids or something. I mean, we're all, that should trouble all of us, not just because it's a horribly wicked thing, but here's this person who was saying one thing and doing the exact opposite. So it's just horrible. And so the hypocrisy adds to it. But if it doesn't matter if we're consistent or not, then that really shouldn't make any difference in the whole thing, you know? And so again, I'm just thinking out loud here. What do you guys think of that? Like there is something within us that has a problem when someone says one thing and then says the opposite, or says one thing and does the opposite, right? And I think that's because we believe there's something wrong with that, you know? So to say, well, I can be inconsistent, but I don't like it when other people are inconsistent, when other people are hypocrites, you know? So
it also depends on what area, right? You want your physician to be consistent in as many areas as possible, right? Maybe not your younger brother in the parking lot, you know, talking about, you know, God.
Yeah.
So, like as we lived it, but I think you're getting to something really big there, Tim. Like I think that even in that, in the existence of this, there's an intuition. You know, we know when we've been wrong. We know that inconsistency is wrong. And now the question is like, where does that intuition, where's that idea come from? Is it something that's just evolved in us, that we came to this understanding through a process of blind physical forces, or is it something that reflects a transcendent idea or being? I think that's where we need that's where we need to spend our time wrestling.
We want consistent politicians. We want consistent police officers. We want consistent doctors. You know what I'm saying? Like you raised a good point. We demand consistency from these people. And when they aren't, we call it out, right? Yeah. And so it's just, that's such a double kind of standard. Say, well, I can be inconsistent, no big deal. But in reality, it's something we all want.
Well, I wonder, John, if your brother would be okay with other people being inconsistent as well, like not just for himself, but it's just like, oh yeah, and if you're inconsistent, that's fine. I mean, I wonder.
I wonder, and I don't think so. I mean, I think that's part of, like, he doesn't want his wife being inconsistent in her faithfulness to him. I'm absolutely sure of that, you know, or his kids' teachers in correcting his kids' papers. I'm sure he'd appreciate a level of consistency with the rest of the class. And then this goes for all of us too. I'm not just trying to pick on my older brother, because he's a really great man. I mean, he does a lot of good. He runs a nonprofit for inner city kids. I mean, he's dedicated his life to helping others. But even there is an example of somebody, well, why? Like, why are you doing this? You're making no money. You know, you're not like getting any fame, or, you know, you're not gonna, like, what's wrong with you? You know, according to your worldview, why do you want to help people?
Yeah.
It's just another layer. Like I one of the things I really love about this book is it's given me an opportunity, at least personally, to kind of slow down and reprocess the basics. Kind of like we talked about this at our staff meeting this week. I think, Tim, you brought this out in the context of your doubt talk that you're developing. This has given me an opportunity to slow back, like just take a step back and get down to the basics of why do I believe what it is I believe. And every step of the way so far, I mean, it's only been a couple weeks, but I'm asking myself the question, okay, like, does this is a worldview I used to hold. Does it, I haven't thought about it in a long time, deeply. Does it actually reflect reality? Or does it offer an explanation to reality? And is that explanation better than what I'm holding to? And then I think it's really refreshing to me. And like, I think we've been saying this the whole time. It's kind of reaffirming that, wow, okay, Christian theism really does offer very robust answers to the fundamental questions of reality.
Yeah.
And I'm really enjoying it. Trying to get us back to the book. You guys see that?
Yeah, I like that. That was strategic. I was thinking about that. I'm like, oh, that's right.
That was very intentional.
Talk about the book, not just rant on certain area issues. Okay. All right. So I guess we're going to talk about the book. Jeez, I'll pull it out again. What else did you guys like about it or not like about it?
You can go, Tim.
No, I've done a lot of talking. I want to hear from Alan.
Oh, thank God you're going to stop. All right. Yeah. So I'm kidding. So I don't, now I'm trying to remember whether I said this to you before we went live or not, but I think it was afterwards. So I get this sense as I was reading Sayre's work here, that he's not here to critique the worldviews per se, right? I mean, he's presenting the worldviews and he's citing various thinkers who are very representative of, the worldview, and is kind of presenting them like, hey, here's the view, which is fine. That's not necessarily a liability of the book. I mean, if you're reading the book thinking, okay, I want a critique of naturalism, or I want a critique of monism, or I want a critique of Marxism, well, this isn't really it, but it is nice that it gives you a kind of a sense of what each view entails. But that got me wondering, like, because in my mind I'm kind of like, yeah, but I feel like naturalism is bankrupt in so many ways, and this kind of goes back to the whole, when atheists say, well, we don't have to prove anything, like we don't have a burden of proof, we don't have to shoulder anything because our view is a lack of belief, right? And naturalism is sort of the ultimate, in a sense, a lack of belief. Like I don't know. I don't have to believe anything. I don't have to assert anything. I don't have to make a case for anything. But because as I was reading it, I was wanting Sayre to still press the naturalist and demand them that they explain some things, because it seems to me the naturalistic worldview still requires an explanation for things like, okay, well, the naturalist believes that the universe came into existence at some point in the past, all by itself, or it's existed for an eternity. Okay, how is that rational? How is that explainable? How does the universe, all of space, time, energy, matter, pop into existence from nothing? As Bill Craig says, from nothing, nothing comes, right? So I was kind of wanting him to like press into that, and now he does it on the free will thing, because that's another thing. I'm kind of like, okay, well, as a naturalist, you might not say you have any, you're advocating for any, positions that you have to defend, but how do you explain free will? And if you say there's no free will, then how does anything make sense? And then morality, and again, he touches on it, but doesn't really press him on it. Like, are morals real? Are morals objective, or are they subjective? And if they're subjective, how is that relevant? Kind of like you were saying, John. Like, is it just or was it you, Tim? Is it just relativism? So, anyways, that was a feeling of frustration I felt, that I'm thinking, I want the naturalist to explain these three things. Universe out of nothing, free will, or if not, then what? How do you have moral accountability? How do you have all these things? And then morality, like where do morals come from? So again, even though they don't have to, even though they're not maybe asserting these positions, naturalism entails those things. So how do you make sense of them? But again, he's not he's not critiquing these things. He's
Yeah.
just presenting them. Well, anyways, I don't know. I mean, for better or for worse, he doesn't critique him, but that's what in my mind I was thinking as I was reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Alan, that raised a really good point that all of these worldviews need to be defended, right? They stand or fall on the evidence. And I know that you mentioned this certain definition of atheist that just means lack of belief, which I think is mistaken. I did a whole red pen logic video on it. But there's when it comes to these worldviews, and I think atheism is part of this worldview, right? It's entailed. If matter is all there is no God, there's no miracles. I mean, there's certain things that follow from naturalism. But it's not just like, well, Christians, you have to defend your worldview, but I don't have to defend mine. No, the way this thing works is everyone should have arguments and evidence for their particular worldview. But again, I mean, going back to the whole post-truth thing, and this is something Andrew made a comment here on the side, says, I was thinking that post-truth idea was more honest in a way than postmodernism, but that lack of consistency is in its starting, is startling. Thanks. Yeah, I think, I mean, you just turn on the news and what you see playing out, especially, I mean, I'm in Canada here, so I don't watch the news, to be honest, but there's a lot of stuff going on across the border with the election and everything.
You watch American news.
Yeah. And there is, I mean, it's like, if you have the facts on your side, for one thing, and then you hear something that goes against it, you don't change your mind. It's like, well, your preference, you're good with the truth for a little while until the facts don't line up. And then it's like, well, my preferences are going to trump that anyways. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So you can't win that argument. Evidence doesn't matter anymore. It's like, I'm just going to go with my preferences at the end of the day, even if the truth is on my side. So I'll pretend like truth matters when it does agree with my view. And then when it doesn't agree with my view, then you know what? It's all about preferences, right? So I
feel like in a lot of ways, truth has kind of become a commodity, in our culture. It's as opposed to something that's guiding our culture. It's something that's used as a tool to direct a culture towards a presupposition or towards another end. So where truth used to be our goal, right? It's now something we use to get to our feelings, basically, what we want to be true.
Yeah. And
undergirding all of this is the idea that ideas have consequences. And I think that's kind of like what was being stressed earlier as we were talking. These, some of these ideas, sometimes you have to read deep philosophical thoughts, and sometimes you have to really think about this stuff. And luckily, we've had me personally, I've had a lot of guys go before me that I can kind of like what you guys do at STR, right? Before I came on board, you take these high ideas that are hard to understand and kind of translate them and make them low-hanging fruit, so people like me can understand them. And so the reason why it's important to understand them is because they have dire consequences for the way the world actually operates around us. So these ideas that might seem really lofty, this idea of being in a post-truth world, on its face might seem like, who cares? It doesn't affect, the price of broccoli or milk in my supermarket. It doesn't affect, how I'm gonna, what I'm gonna do when my kids get home, what's on the dinner table. But actually it does affect everything in life, because as these ideas trickle down to our culture, now we see the consequences of them, where the nightly news doesn't care about what's true. I'm convinced of that. It's not necessarily their agenda. They're not necessarily concerned with pushing forth that which is true in a fundamental sense. There's agendas, worldviews behind these things, and these discussions that we're having, I think, are weighty, and they lend. They're important to have in the context of everything we're experiencing today, as culture seems to be kind of in a state of upheaval. At least in my neck of the woods, it feels like that. I don't know if that made any sense.
That's good. Agreed.
I was going to make a snarky comment, but I'll just let it go.
Alan, you?
Yeah.
You've never made a snarky comment.
There's another comment here coming from YouTube. Please, how is it possible for naturalistic, or I guess even naturalism, to drive any life meaning from their worldview? So do you guys want to weigh in on that? Meaning, can naturalism, or someone who holds this worldview, have meaning in their life? What would you say?
Well, I guess we'd have to distinguish between objective meaning and subjective meaning. In other words, do we have meaning because there is some transcendent reality that indwells us with meaning and purpose and value? Or is the meaning that we have just a meaning that we believe that we have, almost like a placebo, you know? And so I think if naturalism is true, it would be the latter. There wouldn't be any transcendent reality like a God or someone who invests us with value and purpose and meaning and gives our lives worth. Rather, we would just say, well, my life is meaningful because, and I'll just say whatever, because I have a relationship, or because I'm raising kids, or because I'm making money, but it just seems like a placebo. It's like I choose to believe that. But in the end, if, John Updike's, quote about, you just get buried in a hole and, the rocks eventually over time just cram your skull and your teeth and you just amount to dust, then that meaning, that value, that worth is so temporary in light of eternity that it just makes it seem like there is no value, there is no purpose, there is no inherent worth. So yeah, I don't see how naturalism can provide that. And as I mentioned, Reasonable Faith, the book Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig has an entire chapter devoted to that. Is there meaning to life without God? Which kind of presupposes a naturalistic worldview, and it just kind of unpacks every element of that, and it's pretty bleak.
We're studying. My wife and I are the married pastors married directors. I don't know what title we have, but we teach a Bible study every week.
Married people talking.
Yeah. So last night we had a Zoom Bible study. And we're going through Colossians. And of course, you have this amazing, passage about Christ's supremacy and sufficiency in Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. And it's talking about, and the reason I bring this up is because it says, by him and for him. God created everything, okay? Or Jesus created everything. Jesus is God. But it was by him and for him. And it just occurred to me, because it was for him, there's meaning, there's purpose. Like, this is going somewhere. So when I make something, it has purpose because I gave it that purpose. It's a thing that was created with a teleos, with design in mind for a purpose. And there, right there in the text, it says, look, you were made by God, which is why, by the way, you're valuable, okay? And you were made for God, which means you have meaning. Just in those two things, by him and for him. I just thought, man, this you could preach a whole sermon on that. And right. And so that's the difference between the Christian worldview, which has a creator, and the naturalistic worldview that doesn't. And again, coming back to the consequences. No ultimate meaning or purpose. And by the way, the flip side is, look, you could choose to make money and have a family and do all these really nice things that, people would say, wow, that guy's made a lot of his life. Or you could use your life to hurt people and swindle people out of their life savings and molest people. And you just go down the list. And by the way, those would be just as meaningful if there is no transcendent meaning, because the person, the individual, gets to decide what their meaning is and what their purpose is. So this is the consequence we're talking about. But we obviously say, no, that is a waste of life. That is not using your life in the way it was intended. It's not, you shouldn't be doing that. You know, it should be different. It's supposed to be different. And as Greg says, look you can't get a supposed to if there's without a supposer, right? And so again, this is why, as I was reading, I brought this up at the beginning, the Christian worldview just, man, it makes sense of my experience. Good stuff. Oh, we're getting a good quote here. So we brought up the Colossian stuff. I'll just put up Andrew's comment here.
We're getting a lot of show next time.
He should just be on here. This is really good. All right. Any other thoughts?
What?
Oh, you want me to? Okay. In him, so you got the architect. Through him, agent, Jesus. For him, that's the aim. And it says, he is before all things, antecedent, and by him all things hold together, adhesion, not my own. So he didn't come up with this, but that's what a great alliteration, you know. This is a Baptist pastor right here. He's got his 5 or 6 points.
5-point sermon.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's very good. Thanks, Andrew.
I love it.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. What else, guys? Anything else jumped out at you guys?
I mean, there's a ton that jumped out. I mean, one of the answer that he offers here for the question 3, the worldview question 3, human beings. Yeah. Human beings are complex machines. Personality is an interrelation of chemical and physical properties we do not yet fully understand. In this whole section here, I thought he was, and I brought this up to people who I disagree with in worldview terms, like to naturalists. I bring this up and they get really mad at me. Because I feel like he's like that statement right there is like a God of the gaps argument. We don't fully understand how it's working yet, but we will. But we know it's not transcendent. We know it's not supernatural. It's definitely natural. And on the same thing on page 62, it's the same thing for me. It was like, of course, we're very complex machines, and the mechanism is not yet fully understood. But in 15 years, we're going to be able to understand that. That to me feels like a God of the gaps kind of argument, and I think the naturalist does that a lot. Especially when you start talking about biogenesis or the creation of life and these things. I feel like they appeal to, well, we don't know that yet, but we will. That was just interesting to me.
Yeah.
One of the words that jumped out, and I'm not sure which quote it was, but I just wrote the word down, illusion, in my notes. And it just seems to me, man, you go down the list. Okay. Morality. Well, according to Michael Roos, that it's an illusion. Okay.
Illusion.
If you, okay, so that's morality. What about your free will? Read Sam Harris. It's an illusion too. Your consciousness. Read Daniel Dennett. It's an illusion. You just kind of design.
Value.
It appears design, but it's not design. It's an illusion too. So read Dawkins on that. You kind of go down the list, and there's all these things that I think they're real. I think morality, I think that's real. I think they're moral facts. I think that I'm conscious. I think that, you kind of go down the list. They don't seem like illusions to me. And so you almost got to talk yourself from believing what it seems so commonsensical, and tell yourself, no, those are all an illusion. Those are all an illusion. Those are all an illusion. So it just, again, this seems to me a problem, and it's a theme. We talk about at Stand to Reason that Christianity is the best explanation of reality. But over and over again, I am being told by the naturalistic worldview and the proponents of it that all these things that I think are real aren't real. They're illusions. That's how you make sense of these things. That to me doesn't make sense. It doesn't line up. Any thoughts on that?
It's good.
No, I think it's a great point. I think it nicely captures, I think, really all the elements that Sire brings up in the chapter. And since we're running out of time, it's a good way to kind of wrap up as well. So
Timothy says, "Is this really live?"
it's not. It's
yeah,
not really.
It's an illusion. It is an illusion.
It's just you're just a brain in a vat, and we're just stimulating. You know, we're just some scary lab scientists just poking your brain and giving the illusion that you're watching this live.
Actually, you're watching it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I think that was really well put, Tim. I appreciate that, and I think it's James Sire kind of ends the chapter kind of as a segue into the subsequent chapter, which is not necessarily the chapter we're going to be reading for next time, but as you mentioned, Tim, these are all illusions. And so if they're all illusions and none of them are real, if there is no value, if there is no worth, if there is no free will, if there is no consciousness, then he says, the fears that these questions raised in some minds lead directly to nihilism, which he's tempted to call a worldview, he says, but which is actually a denial of all worldviews. And so the subsequent chapter 5, is on nihilism, which we are going to cover, but the next episode, we're not going to cover that. So in 2 weeks, which will be October 8th, which will cover episode 3, or which will be the third episode, we're going to be covering Marxism, which is in the same chapter that we just read. So chapter 4 on naturalism has 2 kind of worldview implications. One is secular humanism, and the second is Marxism. And so, pages 75 to 81 is your next assigned reading for 2 weeks from now, not next week, but 2 weeks from now. And we'll cover Marxism and specifically dive into kind of the downstream consequences of Marxism, which is critical theory, which of course is something that is very relevant and happening today in our culture, which is precisely why we want to talk about it, And I think it's a great example of kind of like what we talked about today, which is, we see these ideas being played out in culture, but we don't realize that they're grounded in a much larger worldview, a larger philosophy, the philosophy of critical theory, which is grounded in Marxism, which is grounded in naturalism. So it's all just kind of flows together. So that's what we're going to be covering next time. So pages 75 to 81 for next episode, which is in 2 weeks. And since it's only 6 pages, we were thinking we'd also recommend some supplemental reading. Is that right? What did we say we were going to have? We were also going to read?
Well, there's quite a bit that you could read on Neil Shenvi's website. It's Neil Shenvi Apologetics.com. So you want to track with him. There's also
topics, but obviously go to the one on critical theory.
Yeah. And then, John, you mentioned, what was the other video?
Bodhi
Bakum. He has a video from maybe a year ago on cultural Marxism. That's just fantastic.
Yeah.
Right. Let me see if I can.
And then I just wrote a blog on critical race theory. So that's up at the STR blog.
And if people want to hear more about that, I'll actually be interviewing Neil Shenvi today at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So do the math for wherever you're at. That's going to be a fascinating conversation. We're actually talking specifically, it's kind of an angle we're working here. It's talking to your kids about critical theory. So, man, it's just going to be tough because it's a hard conversation to have. There's some terminology that is stuff that we just don't use in everyday conversations. And for many of us, it's a brand new kind of philosophy that's out there, ideology that's out there. So if you want to, we're going to do our best to bring it down. And what would you say to your kid, if they came home from school and said, the teacher's teaching us about intersectionality or white privilege or critical race theory or, these kinds of, how do you have these conversations? If we should be having the sex talk with our kids. We should be having the critical theory talk with our kids. Okay. I'm going to have a few opening comments and then we'll get into the discussion. So that is at 8 p.m. You don't want to miss that.
Yeah, that's going to be awesome.
Yep. And I've just put in the Facebook page or in the comments those resources. So
you're going overtime, Alan.
Yeah, sorry. That's why I was looking over there. So I got your article, John. I got Neil Shenvi's one of the sections where he begins to talk about critical theory. And then also Vodi Bakkum's Cultural Marxism YouTube video, which is about an hour long, which is really good too. So it's awesome. Were you guys wrapping us up? Is that what you were doing while I was doing that?
we were giving more resources for people.
Perfect.
So I think we're good.
And you told them about your thing tonight?
Yeah.
Okay.
See, folks, multitasking is a myth.
I have zero RAM when it comes to multitasking. Like, if I was a computer,
because you're just a biological machine.
Kilobytes of RAM.
Yeah.
I cannot multitask.
Yeah.
My wife hates it too, because when I'm doing the dishes and she starts talking to me and asking me questions, I stop doing dishes. She's like, no, keep doing them. I'm like, well, I can't pay attention to you if I'm doing my dishes.
That's good.
That's a personal problem. All right.
Okay, so everyone's got their homework.
Got your homework. See you guys October 8 in 2 weeks. We'll be back with more from the Jet crew. JT. All right, see you guys. Bye.